Picture this. You're a tank commander in the middle of the Iraqi desert. Visibility is zero, sand is cutting through your vision, like glass shards, and suddenly you hear the terrifying rumble of enemy armor emerging from what looks like the gates of hell itself. The year is 1991, and you're about to witness the most brutal and shocking tank battle that Hollywood could never recreate. Before we dive into this incredible story that will leave you speechless, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell right now because you won't want to miss what happens next. February 26, 1991. The Persian Gulf War is reaching its climax. For months, coalition forces had been preparing for what military strategists called the inevitable ground assault against Saddam Hussein's forces in Kuwait. The Iraqi Republican Guard, once considered the elite of the Middle East, had dug in across the desert landscape like deadly scorpions waiting to strike. But nature was about to become the most unpredictable enemy of all. The morning started like any other in the barren wasteland of southeastern Iraq. American M1A1 Abrams tanks of the 1st Armored Division rolled across the sand dunes in perfect formation. Their 120mm cannons pointed toward the horizon like mechanical fingers of death. The crews inside these 60-ton steel beasts had trained for years for this moment. But nothing could have prepared them for what the desert was about to unleash. Commander James Mitchell, a 28-year-old tank commander from Texas, squinted through his thermal imaging system as the first wisps of sand began to dance across his vision. The weather reports had mentioned possible sandstorms, but in the desert, weather reports were about as reliable as a broken compass. Mitchell had no idea that in less than 3 hours, he would be fighting for his life in conditions that would make the surface of Mars look hospitable. The wind began to pick up around 10 a.m., carrying with it the whispers of an approaching nightmare. At first, it was just a gentle breeze that provided some relief from the oppressive heat that had been baking the tank crews inside their metal coffins. But the desert had other plans. The temperature was rising, and with it, the winds that would soon transform this battlefield into something out of an apocalyptic movie. By 11:30 a.m., the horizon had disappeared. What started as a gentle wind had evolved into a monster that consumed everything in its path. The sandstorm approached like a wall of death, stretching from the earth to the heavens, moving with the inevitability of time itself. From a distance, it looked almost beautiful, like a golden curtain being drawn across the landscape. But beauty in the desert is often the mask that death wears. The first reports crackled through the radio communications. Sandstorm approaching from the northeast, visibility dropping rapidly. But these weren't just words on a radio. To the tank crews, spread across 30 miles of desert, these words meant that their world was about to become a living nightmare where friend and foe would be indistinguishable, where the earth and sky would become one crushing entity. When the storm hit, it didn't arrive gradually. It slammed into the advancing coalition forces like a freight train made of sand and fury. In a matter of minutes, visibility dropped from 20 miles to 20 feet. The sun, which had been blazing overhead like a merciless eye, vanished as if it had never existed. The world became a swirling vortex of sand particles that moved with the violence of a blender, each grain a tiny bullet cutting through the air. Inside his Abrams tank, Commander Mitchell felt the massive machine rock back and forth as winds exceeding 60 miles per hour hammered against the steel hull. The sound was indescribable. Imagine standing inside a drum while someone throws handfuls of gravel against it. Then multiply that by 1,000. The sand found its way into every crack, every opening, every breath. It was as if the desert itself had declared war on everything that dared to exist within its domain. The thermal imaging systems, which had been the eyes of these steel beasts, became useless. The sand created a blanket of uniform temperature that made distinguishing between enemy tanks and rocks impossible. The GPS systems, those electronic lifelines that had guided them across the featureless landscape, began to malfunction as the storm interfered with satellite signals. In a matter of minutes, the most technologically advanced military force in history had been reduced to driving blind through a hellscape. But the storm was just the beginning, as the American forces struggled to maintain formation in the chaos. Iraqi Republican Guard tanks began to emerge from their concealed positions, like ghosts materializing from the sand. The T-72 tanks, inferior in technology, but perfectly adapted to desert warfare, used the storm as cover to launch a coordinated counterattack that would catch the coalition forces completely off guard. The first sign of enemy contact came not from radar or thermal imaging, but from the primitive human sense of hearing. Through the howling wind and the percussion of sand against metal, tank crews began to detect the distinctive rumble of Soviet-made engines. The T-72s were moving, and they were getting closer. Sergeant Rodriguez, the gunner in Mitchell's tank, pressed his face against the periscope and strained to see anything through the wall of sand. "I can't see shit, sir," he reported, his voice tight with tension. "It's like looking through chocolate milk." But then, for just a moment, the wind shifted, and through a brief gap in the storm, he saw something that made his blood freeze. The silhouette of an enemy tank less than 500 meters away, its gun barrel turning in their direction. The Battle of 73 Easting was about to begin, but this time it would be fought under conditions that no military academy had ever prepared them for. The Iraqi forces, commanded by experienced officers who had fought through 8 years of brutal war against Iran, knew how to use the desert as a weapon. They had positioned their tanks in a defensive line that stretched across the storm's path, turning the natural disaster into a tactical advantage. When the first shots were fired, the muzzle flashes created brief moments of illumination in the brown darkness, like lightning in a sand-filled sky. The sound of the 120mm cannon firing inside the storm was unlike anything the crews had experienced. The normal crack of the gun was muffled and distorted by the wind, creating an eerie, hollow boom that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. If you're already gripped by this incredible story, imagine what's still to come. Hit that like button now and share this video with someone who loves incredible military history, because this battle is about to reach a level of intensity that will leave you speechless. The engagement that followed was unlike any tank battle in military history. Crews fired at muzzle flashes in the storm, unable to identify targets until the moment of impact. The sand acted like a curtain that concealed both hunter and hunted, making every shot a gamble with death. Tank commanders had to rely on instinct, experience, and pure luck to survive. Commander Mitchell's tank crew found themselves in a deadly game of cat and mouse with at least 3 Iraqi T-72s. In the swirling chaos of the storm, distances became impossible to judge. A tank that appeared to be 1,000 meters away could actually be 300 meters, close enough that a direct hit would penetrate even the Abrams' formidable armor. The crew worked in perfect synchronization, their training taking over where their senses had failed. The loader, Private Johnson, a 19-year-old from Detroit, fed 120mm shells into the cannon with mechanical precision, his hands moving from muscle memory even as sand filled his eyes and mouth. Each shell weighed over 40 pounds, but adrenaline and fear had turned him into a machine. He could feel the tank shudder with each shot, could smell the acrid smoke of the cannon mixed with the dust and heat of the desert. The driver, Corporal Thompson, fought to keep the 60-ton monster moving forward through sand dunes that shifted like liquid under the storm's fury. The track struggled for purchase on the loose sand, which had been churned into a soft, treacherous surface by the wind. It was like trying to drive through quicksand while being attacked by invisible enemies. Meanwhile, the Iraqi crews were fighting with a desperation born of knowing they were defending their homeland against what they saw as invaders. The T-72 tanks, though older and less sophisticated than the American Abrams, were crewed by men who had learned to fight in conditions that would break most soldiers. They had survived the Iran-Iraq War, 8 years of brutal conflict that had taught them that survival depended on cunning, courage, and the ability to turn any situation to their advantage. Captain Hassan al-Roshed, commanding an Iraqi tank company, had positioned his forces in a defensive formation that took advantage of the storm's approach. His T-72s were dug into hold-down positions behind sand dunes, their turrets barely visible above the shifting sand. When the storm hit, he gave the order to advance, knowing that the American technological advantage would be neutralized by the wall of sand that now covered the battlefield. The first Iraqi tank to score a hit was commanded by Lieutenant Omar Khalil, a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War who had learned to fight in sandstorms during the desert campaigns near Basra. His T-72 emerged from the storm like a predator, its 125mm cannon already trained on the silhouette of an American tank that appeared and disappeared in the swirling sand. The high explosive shell struck the left side of Sergeant Williams' Abrams with the force of a meteor. The 60-ton tank lurched sideways, its tracks throwing up clouds of sand as it fought to maintain stability. Inside, the crew was thrown against the steel walls like rag dolls. The smell of burning metal and electronics filled the cramped compartment as warning. Lights flashed like a Christmas tree of death. Williams, a 15-year veteran who had served in Panama and the First Gulf War, fought to keep his tank operational even as smoke filled the turret. His left arm was broken, hanging useless at his side, but his right hand never left the controls. "We're hit, but we're still fighting," he reported over the radio, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead, mixing with the sand that had infiltrated every corner of the tank. The battle raged for 3 hours in conditions that defied human comprehension. Visibility fluctuated between 0 and 50 feet, creating a surreal landscape where tanks appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The sound of the battle was unlike anything recorded in military history. The constant roar of the wind, mixed with the crack of cannon fire, the scream of shells passing overhead, and the mechanical grinding of tank tracks fighting for purchase on the shifting sand. Temperature inside the tanks reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The air conditioning systems, designed to keep crews functional in desert conditions, were overwhelmed by the fine sand that infiltrated every filter and vent. Crews fought in conditions that would have killed most people. Their bodies pushed beyond the limits of human endurance by a combination of heat, stress, and the constant threat of death. The turning point came when the storm began to show signs of weakening. Brief gaps appeared in the wall of sand, allowing thermal imaging systems to function for precious seconds at a time. It was during one of these momentary clearings that Sergeant Rodriguez spotted the distinctive silhouette of an Iraqi command tank, its radio antennas marking it as a high-value target. The shot that Rodriguez fired would be remembered as one of the most precise in military history, threading the needle through a gap in the storm that lasted less than 3 seconds. The depleted uranium shell traveled 2,000 meters through the swirling sand and struck the T-7 to just below the turret ring. The explosion was visible even through the storm, a brief fireball that illuminated the desert like a flare. The destruction of the Iraqi command tank marked the beginning of the end for the Republican Guard counterattack. Without coordination from their commanders, the scattered T-72s found themselves fighting individual battles against an enemy they couldn't see. One by one, they were picked off by American tanks whose crews had learned to fight in conditions that no training manual had ever described. When the storm finally began to subside around 3 p.m., the landscape revealed a scene of destruction that looked like something from another planet. Burned-out tanks dotted the desert like metallic tombstones, their blackened hulls testimony to the fury of the battle that had raged in the darkness. The sand around each destroyed vehicle had been turned to glass by the intense heat of the fires, creating bizarre sculptures that glittered in the returning sunlight. The casualty count was staggering. Of the 47 Iraqi tanks that had participated in the counterattack, 41 had been destroyed or disabled. The American forces had lost 8 tanks, with 23 crew members killed and 47 wounded. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. The psychological impact of fighting in such conditions had pushed many of the survivors to the breaking point. Commander Mitchell, his face blackened with sand and smoke, climbed out of his tank and surveyed the battlefield. The silence was almost as overwhelming as the storm had been. No wind, no gunfire, just the distant sound of rescue helicopters approaching across the desert. His tank bore the scars of the battle, its armor pocked with impacts from small arms fire and shrapnel, but it had survived. The medical evacuation that followed was a testament to the courage of the helicopter crews who flew into the aftermath of the battle. The sand-filled air made flying treacherous, but they came anyway, their aircraft loaded with medical supplies and staffed with doctors and nurses, who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in the war. Private Johnson, the young loader who had fed shells into the cannon throughout the battle, was found unconscious in his position, overcome by heat exhaustion and dehydration. His hands were so swollen from handling the heavy shells that the medics had to cut his gloves off. When he regained consciousness 3 hours later in a field hospital, the first thing he asked was whether his crew had survived. The psychological wounds would take longer to heal than the physical ones. Many of the tank crews who fought in the Sandstorm battle would never fully recover from the experience. The constant threat of death, combined with the sensory deprivation and extreme physical conditions, had created a form of trauma that military psychologists were only beginning to understand. Sergeant Rodriguez, the gunner who had made the decisive shot, would later describe the battle as fighting blind in hell. He returned to duty 3 weeks later, but his family noticed that he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, clawing at his face as if trying to remove sand that wasn't there. The desert had left its mark on him, as it had on all of them. The Battle of the Sandstorm, as it came to be known, changed military doctrine forever. The lessons learned in those 3 hours of hell would influence tank design, training procedures, and tactical doctrine for decades to come. The idea that technology could overcome any natural obstacle had been shattered by a wall of sand and wind that had turned the most advanced military equipment in the world into blind machines groping in the dark. The Iraqi crews who survived the battle were taken prisoner, many of them in a state of shock that rivaled that of their American counterparts. Captain al-Rushed, who had planned the counterattack, was found 3 days later wandering in the desert, his uniform torn to shreds by the sand, his mind temporarily shattered by the experience of commanding a battle that had been fought in conditions beyond human comprehension. The intelligence gathered from the prisoners revealed the full scope of what had happened. The Iraqi commanders had planned the attack to coincide with the Sandstorm, knowing that it would neutralize the American technological advantage. What they hadn't counted on was the ferocity of the storm itself, which had turned the battle into a test of human endurance rather than military technology. The aftermath of the battle was studied by military analysts around the world. The footage captured by tank-mounted cameras showed brief, terrifying glimpses of the combat, but the full story could only be told by the men who had lived through it. The audio recordings from the tank intercom systems captured the raw fear and determination of crews fighting for their lives in conditions that pushed the limits of human survival. Years later, when historians would write about the Gulf War, they would describe the Battle of the Sandstorm as a turning point, not just in the conflict, but in the way modern warfare was understood. The idea that superior technology guaranteed victory had been challenged by a natural phenomenon that had reduced the most sophisticated military force in history to fighting with instinct and courage alone. The tanks that survived the battle were eventually retired, their hulls too damaged by the sand and heat to be returned to service. Some were sent to museums where visitors could see the scars left by the desert battle. Others were used for training their battle-damaged armor, serving as a reminder of what could happen when nature became an enemy as dangerous as any human adversary. The crew members who fought in the Sandstorm battle were awarded various decorations for their courage under fire, but many of them would later say that the real honor was simply surviving. They had faced conditions that no human being should ever have to endure, and they had emerged victorious, not through superior firepower or technology, but through the same qualities that had carried soldiers through battles since the beginning of time: courage, determination, and the refusal to give up when giving up would mean death. The desert kept its secrets well, burying the evidence of the battle under layers of shifting sand. But the memory of those 3 hours when man and machine fought against both enemy and nature would live on in the minds of those who were there. A reminder that, in war as in life, the most dangerous enemy is often the one you never see coming. The Battle of the Sandstorm stands as a testament to the courage of ordinary men and women who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances, fighting not just for victory, but for survival itself. It was a battle that proved that in the end, when all the technology fails and all the planning comes to nothing, warfare comes down to the same basic elements it has always depended on: the human spirit and the will to survive. This is a story that reminds us that some of the most incredible moments in military history happened not in the great battles that everyone remembers, but in the forgotten engagements where small groups of people faced impossible odds and somehow found a way to prevail. The tank crews who fought in the Sandstorm that day had no idea they were making history. They were simply trying to stay alive long enough to see another sunset. Thanks for watching this incredible true story until the end. If you want to hear more epic military stories like this one, make sure to subscribe now and hit that notification bell. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another forgotten chapter of military history that will leave you amazed.